could Hamas gun down civilians, burn families alive, and execute children, and do so with glee? How could Hamas take more than 200 people hostage, innocent civilians, including a 9-month-old baby and his 4-year-old brother? How could Hamas justify taking a 23-year-old American citizen, Hirsch, whose parents I met this week? And the answer is they cannot. There is no justification for terror, none whatsoever. You all know that, and we must condemn Hamas's acts of terror. Hamas's goals are single-minded and they're sickening. They're determined to destroy Israel and kill Jews. And let's be clear, Hamas has never cared about the genuine needs or concerns or safety of the people it claims to represent. And Hamas has no respect for the rule of law or human life. To them, Palestinian civilians are expendable. To them, Palestinian civilians are human shields, and it really is despicable and it's cowardly. The lives of innocent Palestinians must be protected. The lives of UN personnel and humanitarian workers and journalists must be protected. And we mourn the loss of every single innocent life in this crisis, every single one. We must not look away, and we must not become numb to the pain and the suffering of people like Wa El-Dadu, a Palestinian journalist whose wife, son, daughter, and grandson were killed in Gaza this week. And my heart breaks for a while. My heart breaks for all of the innocent civilians who are caught up in this crisis. Colleagues, the United States has made clear in both public and private conversations that as Israel exercises its right, and indeed its responsibility, to defend its people against a terrorist group, it must do so in line with the rules of war. There are no law-free zones in war. International humanitarian law must be respected throughout Gaza and the region by all actors. President Biden and Secretary Blinken, in partnership with the UN and regional actors, are engaged in direct diplomacy to help protect the lives of all civilians and to ensure humanitarian assistance can flow into Gaza. As humanitarian organizations have stressed, the needs of Palestinians in Gaza are dire. So many families lack access to food, clean water, and other essentials, and hospitals need fuel to keep patients alive. This is a humanitarian emergency, and we're doing everything in our power to save lives. The United States is the single largest donor to the Palestinian people, having contributed more than $1 billion to UNRWA since 2021. And last week, President Biden announced an additional $100 million in humanitarian assistance for the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank. While in the region, President Biden also secured an agreement with Israel, Egypt, and the United Nations that allowed aid to start reaching Gaza. But much more needs to be done. Much, much more is needed, and it's needed urgently. We continue to encourage Israel, Egypt, and all partners to take concrete steps to alleviate this humanitarian crisis, just as we continue to urge and encourage all member states, particularly those with the greatest capacity to give, to help us meet the UN's appeal for the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Colleagues, time is of the essence, and lives hang in the balance. As you'll notice, two key words are missing in the resolution before us. The first is Hamas. It is outrageous that this resolution fails to name the perpetrators of the October 7th terrorist attack. Hamas. Hamas. It is outrageous. Another key word missing in this resolution is hostage. This resolution makes no mention of the innocent people, including citizens of many of you in this room, many of you here today who have citizens who are being held hostage by Hamas and other terrorist groups. These are omissions of evil, and they give cover to and they empower Hamas's brutality. And no member state should allow that to happen. You should not let it stand. And that is why we have co-sponsored an amendment put forward by Canada that corrects these glaring omissions. This amendment is straightforward and it's unobjectionable. It calls on us to condemn Hamas's terrorist attacks on October 7th, and it calls for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. It should be easy. This is the bare minimum that we would hope to see in this resolution. We urge all member states to vote yes on this amendment. The General Assembly must send a clear message to the world that we stand against all acts of terror and that we stand with all those who are being held hostage. We believe the UN Security Council, a body charged with maintaining international peace and security, must send this same message. And that's why this week we put forward a Security Council resolution that garnered the support of the majority of the Council. In drafting this text, we solicited input from all Council members, including Russia and China. And the product of our consultations was a balanced and strong resolution that, among other things, condemned Hamas's terrorist attacks, called for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, stressed the urgency of addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, including through humanitarian pauses, and made clear that we must keep the hope of a two-state solution alive. Again, this was a strong and balanced text, but unfortunately, Russia and China decided to veto this resolution. And while the United States worked to forge consensus around a balanced product, Russia has put forward bad faith, one-sided resolutions without any consultations whatsoever. Colleagues, one-sided resolutions, whether they are put forward in the Security Council or the General Assembly, will not help to advance peace. Assembly will not help to advance peace, not when they ignore the facts on the ground. One-sided resolutions are purely rhetorical documents that seek to divide us at a time when we should all be coming together, and we must not cling to long-standing lines of division. As President Biden said yesterday, there's no going back to the status quo as it stood on October 6th. We must not go back to the status quo where Hamas terrorizes Israel and uses Palestinian civilians as human shields. And we must not go back to a status quo where extremist settlers can attack and terrorize Palestinians in the West Bank. The status quo is untenable and it is unacceptable. This means that when this crisis is over, there has to be a vision of what comes next. In our view, that vision must be centered around a two-state solution. Getting there will require concerted efforts by all of us, Israelis, Palestinians, regional partners, and global leaders, to put us on a path for peace, to integrate Israel with the region while insisting that the aspirations of the Palestinian people to be part of a more hopeful future. We deeply regret that the resolution now under consideration is detrimental to this vision. But while this resolution is deeply flawed and does not meet this moment, the United States will continue to work with all member states to chart a future where Israelis and Palestinians have equal measures of security, freedom, justice, opportunity, and dignity, and a future where Palestinians realize their legitimate right to self-determination and a state of their own. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States for that statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
President, at the outset, allow me to thank you for convening this crucial debate under the resumed 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly. I also want to express my thanks to the Secretary-General and commend his leadership and personal commitment to the protection of civilians, access of vital humanitarian aid to Gaza, and the resolution of the conflict. President, Ireland unreservedly condemns the heinous and barbaric acts by Hamas on the 7th of October. The deliberate taking of hostages, including women, children and the elderly, is simply unconscionable. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. In the face of such appalling attacks, Israel has the right to defend itself, but must comply with international law, in particular international humanitarian law. We stress the applicability of international humanitarian law to all armed conflict. This includes the prohibition on the targeting of civilians, the prohibitions on indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, the prohibition on collective punishment, and the prohibitions on the taking of hostages and the use of human shields. These are obligations that bind all parties to armed conflict, state and non-state actors alike. Earlier this week, we heard yet another deeply concerning briefing from Special Coordinator Wennesland on the situation on the ground. We are also highly troubled about the impact of recent events on regional stability and call on all regional and international actors to act responsibly. President, we are gravely concerned about the situation in Gaza and the particular impact of the conflict on children. We renew our call on Israel to end the blockade of Gaza and to allow meaningful humanitarian access, especially of fuel, to enable hospitals and relief organisations to function. Civilians in Gaza must have access to basic necessities: water, medicine, food and fuel. There must be rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access for the benefit of civilians in the Gaza Strip. Ireland again echoes the Secretary-General's call for a humanitarian ceasefire or a humanitarian pause to ensure that the humanitarian needs of the population can be comprehensively met. We offer our deepest condolences to the families of the UNRWA staff who have lost their lives during this conflict, and we commend UNRWA and all of the UN and humanitarian personnel on the ground for their selfless work in support of the people of Gaza and across the Middle East. In response to the unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe now unfolding in the Gaza Strip, Ireland has announced an immediate package of €13 million last week, €10 million for UNRWA and €3 million for UN OCHA's Palestine Humanitarian Fund. We urge other partners to also step up and support this vital work. We are also highly concerned at the serious increase in violence in the West Bank, including further forced displacement of Palestinian communities. President, colleagues, a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in the Middle East may seem further away than ever. However, we must all work towards this end. Lasting peace can only be based on an enduring commitment to mutual recognition, freedom from violence, incitement and terror, and a two-state solution. We reaffirm our support for these principles here today. Ireland's position on how to achieve this is long-standing and based on respect for international law and the agreed international parameters. The two-state solution that ends the occupation, that meets Israeli and Palestinian security needs and Palestinian aspirations for statehood and sovereignty based on the 1967 borders, and with Jerusalem as the capital of both states, offers the only prospect for sustainable peace. Ireland has consistently opposed all uses of the veto in the Security Council, and we will continue to do so. We welcome these General Assembly debates as a means of calling the permanent members to account when they prevent the Council from taking action in defence of international peace and security. I thank you, Mr. President.
The distinguished representative of Ireland for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Singapore.
Mr. President, Singapore welcomes the convening of this emergency special session of the General Assembly. We are disappointed that the Security Council, which has met on several occasions to discuss this issue, was not able to agree on a prompt and united response. Mr. President, at the outset, I wish to express Singapore's utmost support for the efforts of the UN Secretary General to sustain the flow of humanitarian assistance to the civilians affected by this terrible tragedy in Gaza. We commend the Secretary General for his leadership role in facilitating the flow of humanitarian assistance and recognize the important contribution made by UN agencies and other humanitarian organizations on the ground. We support all efforts to diffuse tensions in order to avoid an escalation of the conflict. Mr. President, respect for the UN Charter and for international law has always been a fundamental guiding principle of Singapore's foreign policy. The UN Charter and international law provide the foundation for international peace and security. On the 7th of October, Hamas carried out a major coordinated terrorist attack on Israel, deliberately targeting civilians, murdering and kidnapping them, and perpetrating abhorrent acts of terror. We mourn the loss and suffering of so many innocent civilians, including children and the elderly. This attack cannot be condoned or justified by any rationale. We condemn this terrorist attack in the strongest possible terms, and we also call for the immediate and safe release of all hostages taken by Hamas. In this regard, it is worth recalling that just in June this year, the General Assembly adopted a resolution on the global counterterrorism strategy. This calls for the international community to reiterate its strong and unequivocal condemnation of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, committed by whomever, wherever, and for whatever purposes. Mr. President, under international law, Israel has the legitimate right to defend its citizens and its territory. However, Israel also has an obligation to comply with the international humanitarian law. All parties must abide by international humanitarian law and do their utmost to protect the safety and security of civilians. We welcome all efforts to establish and uphold safe zones and routes that will keep civilians out of harm's way and allow for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, Singapore is deeply saddened by the dire humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and by the loss of so many civilian lives. This is a massive humanitarian crisis. We urge all parties involved to allow the rapid, safe, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid and essential services to the civilian population in the Gaza Strip. The Singapore government has made a financial contribution to support humanitarian relief operations through the Singapore Red Cross, and many Singaporeans have also made their own contribution to the relief operations, and it is our hope that their contributions will reach those in need quickly. Mr. President, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a long-standing one, and it must be resolved in accordance with international law and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. This is the only way to stop the repeated cycles of violence. Singapore's position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been consistent. We continue to hold the view that the only viable path to a durable, just and comprehensive solution is a negotiated two-state solution, consistent with the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. We support the right of the Palestinian people to a homeland and Israel's right to live within secure borders. Both Palestinians and Israelis deserve to live in peace, security, and dignity. We call on leaders from both sides to show leadership, to exercise restraint, and to take the difficult but necessary steps towards the vision of a two-state solution. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Singapore for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the EU and its 27 member states, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino. Mr. President, colleagues, first to you, Mr. President, I want to thank you for convening this emergency special session, as the situation is deeply alarming for so many people, and it risks spiraling out of control throughout the region. And I want to take the opportunity to thank the UN and all its personnel for their relentless work on the ground, often at the risk of their lives, as well as the tireless efforts of our Secretary General. Mr. President, we regret that the use of vetoes has prevented the Security Council's efforts from addressing the situation and from fulfilling its mandate and responsibility. This dramatic conflict and the humanitarian situation would have required a united, timely, and strong message by the Council, which the latter failed to deliver. This is deeply regrettable. We know that efforts are still underway to have an outcome at the Council, and we encourage Council members to find that common position soon. The EU's position is well known. The EU reiterates our condemnation in the strongest possible terms of Hamas for its brutal and indiscriminate terrorist attacks across Israel. The use of civilians as human shields by Hamas is a particularly deplorable atrocity. The EU strongly emphasizes Israel's right to defend itself in line with international law and international humanitarian law. We reiterate our call on Hamas to immediately release all hostages without any preconditions. The EU reiterates the importance of ensuring the protection of all civilians at all times in line with international humanitarian law. It deplores all loss of civilian life. We express our gravest concern for the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza, and we call for continued, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access and aid to reach those in need through all necessary measures, including humanitarian corridors and pauses for humanitarian needs. We will work closely with partners in the region to protect civilians, provide assistance, and facilitate access to food, water, medical care, fuel, and shelter, ensuring, of course, that such assistance is not abused by terrorist organizations. We recall the need to avoid regional escalation and to engage with partners in this respect, including, of course, with the Palestinian Authority. The EU is ready to contribute to reviving a political process on the basis of the two-state solution, including through the Peace Day effort, and welcomes diplomatic peace and security initiatives and supports the holding of an international peace conference soon. We stress the need to fight dissemination of disinformation and illegal content and highlights the legal responsibility of the platforms in this context. We understand the rationale to have a resolution at the UN General Assembly in the absence of one at the Security Council, and we have engaged constructively and we have proposed amendments. The priorities and positions that I have outlined here, in addition to the points we made over the last weeks, will guide our approach to the draft resolution put forward. The purpose of the UN is to overcome divisions. I thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, Mr. President, we align ourselves with the statement delivered by Mauritania on behalf of the OIC member states, Jordan on behalf of the Arab group, and Oman on behalf of GCC member states. Mr. President, allow me at the outset to thank you for the resumption of the 10th Special Emergency Session of the General Assembly, a session that is convening in the light of the catastrophic conditions and circumstances faced by the Palestinian people as a result of this military disproportionate bloody campaign against them by Israeli occupation forces. In light of these critical and painful conditions, and following the dangerous developments in Gaza Strip, thousands of civilians, children, women, and elderly are killed. Hospitals, schools, shelters, and infrastructure are bombed. This does not create only a humanitarian catastrophe, but have also dire consequences and repercussions to the security of the region and the world. We have and clearly condemned the targeting of civilians by any party. We called for a ceasefire, stop the bloodshed, lift and immediate lift of the siege, the release of hostages, provide humanitarian assistance and support to those affected. We also condemn the attempts at forcible displacement and policies of collective punishment against the population in Gaza, including the starvation of civilians as a weapon of war, the prevention of access and delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians, or depriving them of their basic needs, life-saving basic needs. We reaffirm that our priority is to work for peace and call for compliance laws. The current crisis is a result of the failure of the international community to end the occupation and implement the two-state solution. Silence in the face of illegitimate Israeli practices, whether over the past 70 years or even recently, is what led the region to the current crisis. We warn again of the possibility of a spillover of this conflict in a manner that would threaten all the peoples in the region and international peace and security. Mr. President, in light of the siege, the killing and the displacement and the failure of the international community until this date to call for a ceasefire and allow the entry of necessary humanitarian aid, we express discontent regarding the double standards and the selectivity in addressing this crisis, and we express our deep regret regarding this hesitation to support the right of the Palestinian people to live a dignified life or to condemn the current humanitarian tragedy that they are living under. Mr. President, safeguarding international peace and security is at the heart of the work of this organization. Today, we see that the organization fails to undertake its important role with all the delays in finding a solution that addresses this crisis, and in light of the ongoing Israeli violations of international conventions, including the international humanitarian law. This undermines trust and confidence in international mechanisms and the credibility of those who defend them. This will adversely impact our capacity to safeguard international peace and security. To achieve justice and a balance should not be done through looking at things from one perspective. And here I would like to reiterate what the UN Secretary General mentioned, that it is important to acknowledge that those attacks did not come from nowhere, were not a result of a vacuum. The Palestinian people had suffered from a strangulating occupation for 56 years. The time has come for the organization to undertake and perform its responsibilities for which it was established, for the international community to take a firm and serious position to end the killing of defenseless civilians, lift the siege, and ensure the prompt entry of humanitarian and relief and aid in terms of food, water, and medicine, to prevent further exacerbation of the tragedy and prevent a spillover of the conflict, undermining the international and regional security. Mr. President, we are making all efforts in communication with brotherly and friendly countries to find an effective and practical and prompt solution that will stop the bloodshed and put an end to this escalation and an end to the ongoing and escalating cycles of violence in the region. We work for a better future for our region. We look forward for it to enjoy peace, stability, and development. And we reiterate our demand to push the peace process forward in accordance with Security Council resolutions and the Arab Peace Initiative that aim at finding a just and comprehensive solution, the establishment of an independent Palestinian state on the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital in a manner that would realize peace, stability, and prosperity for all. In conclusion, Mr. President, we call on member states to co-sponsor and support the draft resolution submitted today, which seeks to serve the best interest of international peace and security. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malta.
Excellent President, Excellencies, we have convened here today as we collectively grieve for the thousands of Israeli and Palestinian civilians who have lost their lives since 7th October. This is one of the darkest and most volatile periods that the Middle East has seen in recent years. Hamas's heinous and terrorist crimes of 7th October, as well as the indiscriminate rocket fire on civilians in Israel, which we condemn in the strongest possible terms, will resonate for generations, manifested as trauma, anguish, anger, and heartbreak. Many Israelis are still living the nightmare of knowing that their loved ones continue to suffer. Terror has no justification, and we must be clear in rejecting it. Hamas must immediately and unconditionally release all hostages. Israel has the right to self-defense in line with international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, necessity, and proportionality. On the other hand, on the other side of Gaza's wall, it is not only hostages who are suffering. Millions of Palestinian civilians are under siege with extremely limited access to water, food, fuel, electricity, medicine, or shelter, if any. In conformity with international law, all parties are obliged to ensure that civilians are protected. We must urgently and genuinely address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Malta continues to strongly call for the establishment of a humanitarian ceasefire or pauses and humanitarian corridors. People must be allowed to bury their dead. Hospitals need fuel and anesthesia. Over 2 million people require sustenance. Sustained provision of life-saving services is paramount. The protection of humanitarian facilities, such as hospitals and designated safe zones, and the unimpeded access for humanitarian and UN personnel, including aid convoys, is also critical. We are devastated to learn that 35 UNRWA humanitarians have lost their lives in Gaza. We commend the agency for its heroic work these past weeks. As diplomats, we urgently need to do our job to allow them the ability to keep doing theirs. Malta welcomes current efforts towards allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza through Rafah and commends all partners involved. However, we note the current volume of aid is limited and needs to be adequately scaled up. This crisis is also having a devastating impact on women and children. Ensuring that humanitarian supplies are gender responsive and that women are involved in distribution is essential for meeting the needs of women and girls who are at higher risk of gender-based violence and psychological trauma. President, the conflict has reawakened tangible risks of regional fissures and increased further uncertainty in an already turbulent world. We must collectively unite to mitigate any risks or miscalculations which may lead this conflict to spill over into the West Bank or into the broader Middle East region. We call for all parties to exercise restraint, de-escalate, and respect the norms of international law. In view of such urgent necessities and risks, Malta is now closely working together with the elected members of the Security Council on a text that we hope can garner consensus and address the situation on the ground. Palestinians have, for far too long, dreamt of a reality which embraces their legitimate aspirations, which isn't choked by decades of occupation, violence, and displacement, a reality which ensures the dignity of their children. Israelis too deserve to live in peace and security without being held hostage by terror. To this end, Malta remains committed to a lasting and sustainable peace in the Middle East, a peace which is based on a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as a future capital of two states, living side by side in peace and security, in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. We therefore urge all member states to support the draft resolution which is before us today. Peace is not optional and demands to be steered by a recognition of our common humanity. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malta for her statement and now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this resumed 10th emergency session of the General Assembly in response to the request of the Arab and OIC groups. Mr. President, we are witnessing a human tragedy of epic proportions unfold in front of our eyes. Israel's campaign of bombardment and airstrikes that has now continued for 20 days has killed 7,000 helpless Palestinians, half of them children, and wounded 17,000 others. Entire families and neighborhoods have been wiped out. The Palestinians are being bombed indiscriminately and without mercy or compunction. Their essential lifelines, water, food, fuel, have been cut off. Over 1 million Palestinians are internally displaced in Gaza. And even those who are displaced cannot hide from the Israeli bombs which rain upon them. 40% of Gaza City has been destroyed. And yet, the Israeli onslaught continues. It has also spread, almost without note, to the West Bank. 37 staff members of the UN Relief Works Agency, UNRWA, in Palestine have tragically lost their lives, many with their families and their homes gone. 40 UNRWA buildings and warehouses have been damaged by Israeli airstrikes. As noted by one UN official working in Palestine, in Gaza, the largest open-air prison in the world, it has today become the graveyard of a population trapped between war, siege, and deprivation. Mr. President, Pakistan strongly and unequivocally condemns Israeli airstrikes and the systematic and barbaric crimes against the Palestinians, particularly the attacks on schools and residential buildings and even hospitals, such as the Ali Baptist Hospital, where hundreds of sick and injured civilians, men, women, and children, were killed. These Israeli attacks on civilians, civilian objects, and infrastructure, blockade of water, food, and fuel, as well as the forced transfer of people from the occupied territory, are flagrant violations of international humanitarian law and amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Indeed, Mr. President, what we are witnessing on our television screens, what the people of Palestine in Gaza are suffering, may amount to a veritable genocide. As our Secretary General has warned, and as we can all perceive, the situation, I quote, is growing more dire by the hour, unquote. The war, quote, risks spiraling throughout the region, unquote. In this moment, the Secretary General has said, it is vital to be clear on principles, starting with the fundamental principle of respecting and protecting civilians, unquote. Mr. President, we are repelled by the crude and disrespectful Israeli response to the Secretary General's circumspect and valid views. The General Assembly should collectively reject these insulting remarks and reaffirm our full confidence in the Secretary General. Mr. President, as human beings, we must be appalled at the magnitude of the suffering of the helpless Palestinian civilians, especially the children and women. I am sure all of us are also appalled at the vicious and callous way that the Palestinians are being slaughtered by cowardly aerial bombardment and long-range artillery. They are being crucified, not by a militant organization, but by a government which claims to be democratic. And we must also be appalled by those who, by blocking the call for a ceasefire in the Security Council, have enabled the continuation of the Israeli slaughter of innocents. It is the hope of the Arab and OIC countries that the General Assembly, acting under the Uniting for Peace process, will succeed where the Security Council has failed. The co-sponsors of the draft resolution in document EA/ES 10/L25 seek three objectives. One, an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. The Israeli killing machine must be stopped in Gaza and the West Bank. Two, the flow of sufficient and sustained humanitarian assistance into Gaza to preserve lives and prevent further suffering of innocent Palestinians. And three, to ensure that the Palestinian population of Gaza is not further displaced within or outside Gaza. Mr. President, it is shocking that even these largely humanitarian objectives, set out in the most circumspect language, have been opposed by some in the General Assembly. Even the call for a ceasefire has faced objections. This position is unjustifiable, legally and morally. Furthermore, an amendment has been moved to insert condemnatory language that is one-sided, discriminatory, and legally contentious. If equity is to be served, we would need to insert language to reflect the realities of this war in a balanced and clear manner. One, to reaffirm the right of the Palestinian people under international law to struggle by all possible means, including armed struggle, to secure their freedom from foreign occupation and exercise their right to self-determination. And two, to strongly and unequivocally condemn Israel's barbarous and indiscriminate bombing of Palestinian civilians and protected objects and sites in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. Without such balancing language, we will vote resolutely against the one-sided Canadian amendment. Mr. President, in the context of this war, consideration should also be given to some form of an accountability mechanism. The crimes that are being committed cannot go unpunished. We have several recent precedents of accountability mechanisms from which to choose. And finally, for the future, we need to consider ways to prevent a recurrence of this slaughter. The OIC foreign ministers have proposed the deployment of a protection force to safeguard Palestinian civilians in the Gaza and perhaps also in the West Bank. We should give serious consideration to this. Mr. President, it is only once this war is brought to an end, once the killing stops, that we can turn to find a durable solution. The resolution which we have presented seeks to do just that, to stop the killing, to stop the war, and turn back to find a durable political solution. I urge all member states to vote for our resolution. I urge them all to vote against the one-sided Canadian amendment. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Pakistan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Mr. President, Thailand welcomes the convening of this 10th Emergency Special Session of the United Nations General Assembly today because of the urgency of the situation and plight of all affected civilians. Thailand is deeply concerned over the escalation of hostilities and violence in the Middle East caused by the unprecedented developments in Israel and Gaza. The heightened hostilities and the scale and scope of violence have claimed thousands of innocent lives, with many more injured and displaced. These include children, women, the elderly, and the sick. The massive and escalating use of force have destroyed their livelihoods and communities. Thailand is profoundly shocked and deeply saddened by the attack on Al Ahli Arab Hospital in the north of Gaza, resulting in loss of life of innocent civilians and casualties. To alleviate the suffering by civilians, we oppose the withholding of access to basic necessities such as water, food, electricity, and fuel as weapons of war. Now, such access should be restored. We also oppose the targeting of critical civilian infrastructure. This should cease. Thailand offers our deepest condolences to everyone who lost their lives and their bereaved families. Our deepest sympathies are extended to all those who are suffering. No family should have to face such tragedy. No family should have to feel such anguish. No family should have to mourn such loss of loved ones. We are also victims. Thai nationals have been killed and injured. We are deeply concerned for the safety of Thai nationals as well as those captured and held hostage. We strongly appeal for their immediate release and safe return. This has been echoed by the ASEAN foreign ministers in their statement of 20 October. We thus welcome the references in the draft resolution calling for their immediate and unconditional release. Thailand condemns in the strongest terms all forms of violence and attacks on civilians in conflict situations, including capturing and taking them hostage. Thailand urges all sides to respect and fulfill their obligations under international humanitarian law and to ensure the safety and dignity of civilians in conflict situations. The protection of innocent lives and civilians must be a priority at all times. This should be our calling at this critical juncture, alleviate the suffering. As the situation escalates, the most urgent concern is for all civilians who have been affected. Unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance must be ensured. We welcome efforts by various parties to ensure such access to humanitarian assistance, and in this connection, we welcome the initial humanitarian relief that has recently entered into Gaza and hope that this will be increased in the days ahead. Many lives are at stake. Many more are at risk. We appeal to the international community to continue to mobilize humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza to ensure that they have access to basic necessities, including safe and clean water, food, and medical care. Thailand joins others in the call for all sides to take immediate steps to prevent the escalation of violence and implement an immediate ceasefire. We appeal all sides to seek all avenues to resolve the current situation, and work towards a long-term peace through diplomacy. Thailand will continue to support the United Nations and the international community in any way we can to de-escalate the situation. We reaffirm our support for genuine dialogue with a view to finding a mutually agreed peaceful solution to the issue in accordance with the two-state solution, by which the states of Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace and security within secure and recognized borders consistent with relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions. Let us do our utmost to save lives and to bring those captured and held hostage home. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Thailand for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Mr. President, Vietnam is participating in this emergency special session with a heavy heart and with great concern on the escalated situation in the Middle East. It is regrettable that the Security Council has been unable to take action on this urgent matter. We urge the Council to continue to work together to address the situation immediately. We also hope that the Council and the UN at large can send a unified and constructive message aimed at de-escalating tensions, ending hostilities, protecting civilians, and promoting dialogue and negotiations. Mr. President, my home country is not unfamiliar with disproportionate casualties and the destruction of critical infrastructure in situations of conflict. This takes an incredibly heavy toll, not only on human life, but also on socio-economic foundations that impede development for decades. Vietnam, therefore, once and again condemns in the strongest terms all indiscriminate attacks targeted at civilians and critical civilian infrastructure. They must be protected under international law, especially in compliance with international humanitarian law and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. I'd like to express our deep sympathy and condolences to the families of all civilians who lost their lives, including UN workers, in the recent flare-ups of conflict starting on October 7th and continuous events thereafter. If history can tell us anything, it is innocent civilians who bear the brunt of armed conflicts. All human life is precious, irrespective of race, religions, or gender. This is why all acts of hostilities and violence must end immediately in order to stop further suffering and bloodshed. Hostages must be safely released at once and without conditions. We strongly urge all parties to refrain from the use of force and exercise utmost restraint. Violence only incites more violence. There is a lot of work to be done. We call for urgent provisions, especially by the UN, of rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian assistance. Water, food, medical supplies, fuel, and electricity must reach those in serious need. We urge all concerned parties to make every effort to facilitate this. Vietnam welcomes and commends all international mediation and reconciliation efforts towards a peaceful, just, and lasting resolution to this conflict, which must be based on international law and relevant resolutions of the United Nations. Durable peace can only be achieved through a comprehensive solution. It is our consistent position to support the two-step solution for the establishment of an independent state of Palestine that coexists in peace with the state of Israel based on the pre-1967 borders and with East Jerusalem as its capital. Vietnam calls upon all concerned parties to work towards an environment that is conducive to the cessation of hostilities, the escalation of tensions, and the return to peace talks and negotiations. All of us must actively contribute to that end. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria.
Mr. President, Excellencies, Austria aligns itself with the statement of the European Union held earlier. At the outset, let me once again emphasize that Austria condemns the heinous terrorist attack by Hamas on Israeli civilians on 7 October in the strongest possible terms. The attack was unprecedented in its brutality. There is no justification for terror. Israel has the inherent right to defend itself in the face of such violent and indiscriminate attacks in line with international humanitarian law. We call for an immediate and unconditional release of all hostages abducted by Hamas and other terrorist organizations. Our joint priority must now be to prevent a regional escalation of violence and hostilities, and we welcome efforts of all partners in this regard. We call on all regional actors to refrain from any action that adds further fuel to the fire. Colleagues, let's be clear. It was the barbaric terror attack by Hamas that brought unbearable suffering on innocent people. It is Hamas that puts the civilian population in Gaza in harm's way, including by using them as human shields. By purposefully directing its resources and urgently needed fuel to its rocket launchers instead of to desalination plants and hospitals, Hamas also bears responsibility for the humanitarian hardships of the civilians in Gaza. Colleagues, international humanitarian law must be respected at all times. It is crucial to ensure the protection of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, and to allow humanitarian access to deliver food, water, and medicine to Gaza. We express our concern at the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza and reiterate the importance of the provision of urgent humanitarian aid and ensure that it is not abused by terrorist organizations. We support the call for safe, full, and unimpeded access throughout Gaza and a sustained effort to deliver vital life-saving assistance to the population. We welcome the recent humanitarian deliveries via the Rafah crossing point and thank all actors involved, including Egypt, the United States, the United Nations, and Israel in facilitating these deliveries. Mr. President, both Israelis and Palestinians have the right to live in peace and security. We should not allow anyone to undermine the positive dynamic that led to a normalization of relations between several Arab countries and Israel. But it has come more than clear who is not interested in any sort of peace: Hamas and other terror organizations. They have no future to offer to the Palestinian people. Genuine peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians alike can only be achieved through a political solution. For us, the goal is clear. We need a negotiated two-state solution allowing Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side in peace and security. Our guiding principle is and will remain international law. Mr. President, let me briefly turn to another aspect of this debate. One reason for gathering in the GA today is that several vetoes prevented the Security Council from adopting a resolution. As we have said at other occasions, the veto right of the permanent members should not paralyze the Security Council from discharging its duties. We therefore welcome that we've had the opportunity to have this discussion here today. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Austria for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this emergency special session. For 3 weeks now, unspeakable scenes of human suffering continue to unfold in Gaza. Millions of civilians are under indiscriminate bombing. They are deprived of water, food, electricity, and fuel, collectively punished under a complete siege. There can be no justification for the indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. These acts of collective punishment and attempts at forced displacement of people are unacceptable and have to be stopped. We must be unequivocal in condemning and opposing loss of each and every innocent life. There is an urgent need for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Uninterrupted humanitarian access to and within Gaza is also an absolute necessity. In this connection, we commend the efforts of the Secretary General and relevant UN agencies on the ground. Mr. President, under these dire circumstances, international community has to come up with a unified position to make these imperatives happen. It is the responsibility of the United Nations to help achieve this unity and deliver results in terms of maintaining international peace and security. However, this has not been possible until now due to the paralysis of the Security Council. Therefore, it is incumbent upon the General Assembly to rise to the occasion and do its utmost to make UN system function. It is in this understanding that as Turkey we co-sponsored the draft resolution entitled Protection of Civilians and Upholding Legal and Humanitarian Obligations, and call all member states to support this resolution. It includes the bare minimum requirements to stop the carnage and help de-escalate the situation on the ground. Mr. President, we must prevent this conflict from spilling out of control and spilling over other areas. Sustained security cannot be achieved by targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. No peace is possible or sustainable as long as the Palestinian aspirations for freedom, dignity, and statehood continue to be oppressed. A just and comprehensive settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can only be realized through a peace process based on two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Turkey for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Tunisia welcomes the convening of this 10th emergency special session on the question of Palestine, and we support the statement delivered by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan on behalf of the Arab group, as well as a statement delivered by the distinguished representative of Mauritania on behalf of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, and we wish to deliver the following remarks in our national capacity. After the failure by the Security Council on a number of occasions to adopt a resolution to end the aggression and genocide perpetrated by the occupying forces against the Palestinian people over the past 3 weeks, what has resulted in 7,000 martyrs up until this point, we hope that the international community will be able to take this emergency session and to meet its historic and moral responsibility and to uphold justice, law, and the values upon which this organization was established, as well as human rights, peace, and security. While we condemn categorically the war crimes perpetrated by the occupying power against Palestinian civilians and the systematic targeting of women, children, families with targeted attacks, targeting hospitals and emergency personnel, holy sites being targeted, as well as with policies which are geared towards halting essential services. These are being used as means of war. We cannot allow the international community to remain silent and for the failure of international institutions and bodies. First and foremost, the Security Council, their failure to uphold their responsibility. What does the international community expect in terms of action? How many what is the international community is waiting to act? How many Palestinian civilians need to die for the international community to honor its moral and humanitarian responsibility, as well as its legal responsibility, which requires for an immediate ceasefire? As we have stated on a number of occasions, we reject the double standards, the selectivity when it comes to international law, and we call for an end to manipulation for the distorted realities and attempts to justify crimes. We urge the Secretary General to continue efforts to achieve a ceasefire and to deliver humanitarian assistance to Gaza. And we reject the attacks against the Secretary General. Mr. President, we find ourselves at a critical juncture. We are bearing witness to a genocide and the forced eviction of the residents of Gaza from their territory, as well as practices of blockade and unprecedented violations of their right. This is carried out in the eyes of the world, and this is carried out in a manner that is in contempt for all international bodies. If in the international community, the United Nations and institutions fail to intervene today, they will not rise to the magnitude of this crisis. If they fail to stop these heinous crimes against humanity, and if they fail to deliver uninterrupted, unselective humanitarian assistance, if they fail to stop the evictions of Palestinian people, then there will be no achievement of justice. The international community will then have agreed to find itself hostage to egregious violations of international humanitarian law, human rights, and all the principles and values upon which the United Nations was founded. Mr. President, Tunisia takes great care to uphold the principles of justice and law. We reject any forms of injustice and aggression. We reiterate our support for the fraternal Palestinian people, and we call for an end to war crimes being perpetrated by the occupying forces. And we call for respect for rights. We reject the equivalence between the occupying aggressor and the aggressed, and we reject the attempts to advance erroneous ideas about the rights to self-defense to justify genocide. Justice is clear, and the rights of human the Palestinian people need to be inviolable and upheld. We hope that the General Assembly will adopt a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire to end further bloodletting, to deliver protection to the Palestinian people, and to prevent attempts to evict people by force while delivering humanitarian and medical assistance in an ongoing way to the Gaza Strip. In this regard, we call on member states to support the draft resolution tabled by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan to end this humanitarian tragedy. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tunisia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Brazil welcomes the reconvening of the 10th emergency session of the General Assembly after the failure by the Security Council to adopt any of 4 draft resolutions on the situation in Israel and Palestine. One of them was proposed by Brazil and not adopted due to the veto of 1 permanent member, despite having received 12 votes in favor, 4/5 of the Council membership. We worked tirelessly in an inclusive and constructive manner with diligence and sense of duty with all delegations willing to engage with our proposal. Our goal was that of presenting a text that carried a resolute and united response by the Security Council. We did not shy away from the negotiations and deliberations on the proposals that were put forward by other members of the Security Council. We still believe that our first draft could have been the best possible outcome of the Council when we presented it. The robust support given by Council members to the resolution, for which we are very grateful, indicates that it was a balanced text. It was solidly rooted in international humanitarian law and international human rights law, and fundamentally committed to the humanitarian imperative. Such imperative demands that we be clear and firm in our condemnation of all violence against all civilians, Israelis, Palestinians, or otherwise. This is why my delegation expressed and now reiterates Brazil's unequivocal condemnation of the heinous terrorist acts by Hamas, including the taking of hostages. This is also why we clearly condemn the attacks that are indiscriminately killing and wounding civilians and destroying civilian objects in the Gaza Strip, and the deprivation of its civilian population of means indispensable for their survival. It is again the humanitarian imperative and international humanitarian law that indicate what must be done. All hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released. Continuous, sufficient and unhindered provision of essential goods and services to civilians throughout the Gaza Strip, including but not limited to water, food, medical supplies, fuel, and electricity, must be secured. It is also urgent to guarantee full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access. Mechanisms such as humanitarian pauses and corridors must be swiftly established to facilitate the provision of humanitarian aid. A cessation of hostilities is urgently needed so that conditions be created for a complete, durable, and respected ceasefire. Our collective response to this crisis, which we all fear will only aggravate if nothing is done, will be a watershed moment for the United Nations. It will be a testament to the effectiveness of multilateralism or its further weakening. It will show whether the United Nations can be serious about preventing, stopping, or at least mitigating the horrors of war. This Assembly and the Security Council must act decisively. The world is watching us, and this is not rhetoric. The world is truly watching us and expects an effective response. Brazil will continue to work tirelessly as President and then as a regular member of the Security Council to make its voice heard loud and clear on this heartbreaking conflict. And when the immediate crisis is overcome, We all must redouble efforts to address the root causes of the tragedy unfolding before our eyes. Mere conflict management has failed. It is the recipe for continued violence.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
On behalf of God, the merciful, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank you for having agreed to the request to hold the 10th emergency session of the General Assembly concerning the issue of Palestine. We support the statement made by the representative of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan on behalf of the Arab group and Mauritania on behalf of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation. Mr. President, the catastrophic situation of the Palestinian people due to the military actions and the barbaric crimes committed by the occupation forces, and in view of the blockade and the lack of provision of basic necessities, and blockade forces us, members of the United Nations, in conformity with the purposes and principles of the Charter, to fulfill our collective responsibility to put an end to the crimes, massacres, and continued destruction of residential neighborhoods with their residents and infrastructure and services. After all these crimes, how can you explain the silence? How can you interpret the failure to take any binding measures to stop these crimes? What can we say about the continuation of massacres and genocide by the occupation forces without any kind of deterrence? Is that an encouragement for the Israeli occupation forces to continue these crimes under the false pretext? Mr. President, we are witnessing a historic turning point within the United Nations, which was created to build and achieve international peace and security. Indeed, the Security Council for the past 3 weeks has failed to fulfill its legal responsibility and to adopt necessary measures to maintain international peace and security and to protect civilians and to stop the bloodletting that is by stopping military activity, or to open border crossing points to ensure the delivery of humanitarian assistance. We note with regret that the organization is incapable of upholding its principles. For decades, this organization has not been able to resolve the Palestinian issue. Mr. President, this extraordinary session is taking place due to the continuation of Israeli attacks for the past 3 weeks against the Palestinian people, brethren people, in particular in the Gaza Strip. This is a systematic genocide and the imposition of a blockade and forced expulsion. These are crimes that continue, a litany of crimes for the past 70 years in front of the very eyes of the international community and the Security Council. This is a flagrant violation of international law and international humanitarian law, of the Charter and of international treaties. Today, as the diplomatic process underway in the Security Council has confirmed that this council is not in a position to fulfill its moral, legal, and humanitarian responsibilities with regard to maintaining international peace and security, and put an end to these barbaric actions and violations against the Palestinian Palestinian people. We find ourselves in the midst of a diplomatic process of the international community that we represent here at this emergency session. We're far from this being selective as far as humanitarian issues and issues of destiny. We must force the occupation forces we must impose a ceasefire, open crossing points, and ensure the delivery of assistance, and completely lift the blockade, stop expulsions, and ensure exchange of prisoners, and ensure the reconstruction following the destruction that has been caused by the occupying forces. This is the tribune to which oppressed people turn to, and we have a collective responsibility to free them from this injustice and grant them the right to life. Many of the images that we're seeing are horrific. Innocent people, women, and children. These images will remain etched in our memories, as will the position of the Security Council in the history of this organization. Lastly, we would like to reiterate our support for the Palestinian people to fulfill their aspirations and legitimate rights that are inviolable, including their right to self-determination, right to return, and the creation of their state, Palestine, with Jerusalem as capital. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Iraq for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom, His Excellency Lord Tariq Ahmed, the Minister for the Middle East, North Africa, and the United Nations. The floor is yours, Lord Tariq.
Thank you, Mr. President. May I begin by expressing our deep appreciation for this institution, the United Nations, and indeed all of our humanitarian partners for their incredible efforts, life-saving efforts, in what are the most challenging of circumstances. And at this point, I also want to share our sincerest of condolences for the 30 UNRWA staff and the 16 medical staff who have lost their lives since the 7th of October. Equally, we record our sincere condolences to the victims and the families of the horrendous Hamas terrorist attacks on the 7th of October on Israel. And equally, we extend our condolences to the families of the innocent Palestinians who have been killed in this tragic conflict. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi rajiun. To God we belong, to God we return. Your Excellencies, Mr. President, every life that is lost is a tragedy, not just for a family in Israel or Gaza or the West Bank, but it is a loss for all of humanity. An Israeli life or a Palestinian life, irrespective of being Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. Every life matters. Every life lost is a tragedy. Therefore, as we recall the tragic consequences of what we are witnessing, we call on all parties to respect international humanitarian law. Yes, this means the unconditional release of the hostages and taking every possible step to avoid the harming of civilians, and importantly, enabling unhindered humanitarian access. We all know, it has been said from this podium countless times during this debate, that the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is growing. On our part, the United Kingdom has provided an additional $37 million to help provide water, to help provide food and medicine and fuel in Gaza. And in this regard, may we put on record our thanks to the tireless work of the Secretary General and the United Nations to ensure this life-saving aid reaches those most in need. Whilst we welcome the important first step of 54 trucks passing through Rafah border crossing, we urge the scaling up of this assistance, including to enable fuel for civilian use to pass into Gaza, vital to keep hospitals and the humanitarian response running. And these humanitarian pauses are an important part of ensuring that this can happen. Turning to the attacks on Israel on the 7th of October, my Prime Minister has been clear. The United Kingdom stands with Israel in the face of Hamas terrorist attacks. We will always support an ally against a terrorist attack and its right to self-defense. But this must be, I assure you, Mr. President, and we make that case, it must be within international humanitarian law. And if I may just put also, from a personal perspective, as a Muslim, terrorism is evil. Every terror act is against humanity, and we should condemn it unequivocally. So, Mr. President, the draft resolution in front of us could have been clearer on this very point. It should also, in our view, unequivocally condemn these terror attacks, Hamas's terror attacks, that killed over 1,400 people, and, as we know, at this very time, hold over 200 hostages. However, we have equally been clear that all possible precautions and steps are taken to minimize harm to civilians in this conflict, and indeed for any movement of civilians to be both voluntary and safe. Mr. President, we stand at a crucial juncture. Yet, in this moment of darkness, let us come together, this United Nations, that we come together and not lose sight of the promise that this United Nations holds true of a two-state solution, a secure, safe Israel, side by side with a viable Palestinian state. And I assure you of this, that we, the United Kingdom, will continue to work closely with all partners in the region and beyond in these efforts, because peace must prevail, and to prevent the situation from spreading and causing wider insecurity and instability. It was my Prime Minister who said, "Hope and humanity must win against the scourge of aggression and terrorism. Love over hate, light over darkness, peace, shalom, salam." Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom, Lord Ahmed, for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Mr. President, Peru would like to express its deepest condolences to the families of the victims, independently of their nationality or religion, and would like to express our unconditional solidarity with the populations affected by the devastating conflict in the Middle East. This conflict has lasted decades without a solution, and that on the 7th of October has seen a new and grave escalation in hostilities. We find ourselves meeting in pursuant to the resolution titled "Uniting for Peace" that states that if the Security Council, due to a lack of unanimity among its permanent members, ceases to fulfill its primary responsibility of maintaining international peace and security, in this context, the General Assembly will immediately consider the matter with a view to addressing appropriate recommendations to the member states in order to maintain or restore international peace and security. End of quote. This did indeed occur in connection with various draft resolutions in the Security Council that were not approved. Mr. President, just a few weeks ago during the general debate, my country addressed member states with a very clear message. Peru promotes peace, and to achieve this peace it is necessary to apply the United Nations Charter in all circumstances. And while the Charter contemplates the right to a veto in its Article 24.2, states that the Security Council, in fulfilling its functions, must proceed in accordance with the purposes and principles of the United Nations and in conformity and in accordance with Article 1.3, its purposes include resolving international problems of a humanitarian character. Consequently, based on a teleological reading and systematic reading of the Charter that Peru has promoted, the veto should not be used as a way of negatively impacting compliance with the purposes of the organization. The current impasse that we find in the Council is extremely concerning. We feel consternation when this is taking place while humankind is observing with stupor the continuing fighting and spilling of blood that has affected thousands of innocent people. As representatives of our nations, we have a responsibility in favor of peace and international security, and we have an obligation to look inside ourselves and to ask ourselves, what are we really doing to remedy this veritable tragedy? Are we fulfilling our duties, or are we ignoring these inexcusably? Are we seeking to reach agreements or blaming each other? The heavy burden of finding answers to these questions obviously is even greater in the case of states that have direct commitment in favor of a lasting and just solution. Last week, the Security Council had a clear and viable solution to take concrete action, the draft resolution presented by Brazil, which reflected in a balanced way the various perspectives and obtained 12 votes. However, one permanent member decided to use their right to a veto, and it would seem that we're still far from a consensus. In these circumstances, Peru reaffirms that we must seek consensus based on the following elements. First of all, to establish a ceasefire for humanitarian aims. Secondly, the firm and unconditional condemnation of all acts of terrorism and acts of violence and hostilities against civilians. Thirdly, unequivocal rejection and condemnation of the horrific terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October, as well as the taking of hostages. And on this point, Peru reiterates unequivocally, due to our own history and experience of this kind of tragedies, our rejection of terrorism, it's all its manifestations wherever it comes from. Fourthly, we demand an immediate and unconditional release of all persons deprived of their liberty and finding themselves as hostages. Fifth, firmly urging all parties to comply with their obligations under international law, and in particular regarding international humanitarian law and international human rights law. In this context, we have a strong commitment in favor of protecting the civilian population, humanitarian personnel, civilian infrastructure, and humanitarian property. Sixth, the approval of concrete provisions to guarantee full, rapid, safe, and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance, as well as the provision of essential basic goods such as water, food, medical supplies for the civilian population. Seventh, the appeal to revoke the order to civilians and UN personnel to evacuate all areas of northern Gaza and to move towards the south of Gaza. On this point, Peru would like to recall that the right to self-defense should be carried out in compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law, and based on the principles of distinction, necessity, proportionality, and precaution. 8. It's essential that all parties act with maximum prudence and humanity and avoid an escalation in the region. Mr. President, we want to express the support of Peru to the work of the Secretary General, and especially for his efforts in the humanitarian sphere. We agree with him that the grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas, and those appalling attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. Peru reaffirms its historic commitment to a definitive solution of the conflict in the Middle East based on international law, which recognizes Israel and Palestine as sovereign states and maintains diplomatic relations with both of these states. Indeed, from a historical perspective, there is an aspect we should not forget. The issue of Palestine is inherently linked to the history of this organization. In 1947, this same General Assembly approved Resolution 181 entitled The Future Government of Palestine, in which it established the existence of two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state. And since 1967, the Security Council has adopted 11 resolutions on this topic. The provisions of these resolutions, in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, are binding on all member states. Lastly, it's urgent that good faith negotiations are resumed to achieve a just and lasting solution that will allow two states, Palestine and Israel, to coexist at last in peace and within safe borders, mutually agreed and internationally recognized in conformity with international norms. On the 19th of July of this year, Peru addressed to the General Assembly in pursuant to Resolution 76/262, when another member state used its right to a vote during a veto during a vote during a draft resolution, a message which is also applicable today. To comply with the purposes of the Charter, it is essential that all members of the Security Council, especially the permanent members, refrain from politicizing humanitarian issues. This implies, inter alia, to stop putting geopolitical considerations ahead of humanitarian issues or emergency assistance. We hope that the proposal that will be presented by the 10 elected members of the Security Council will not be vetoed, and because it reflects the support of the international community. Peru would like to reiterate that obligations under international humanitarian law are permanent. These must be complied fully, even though the Security Council has not managed to agree on this. We would also like to reaffirm our position that humanitarian assistance, wherever it is required, must be provided in a rapid, safe, and unhindered way, and following the principles of humanity, neutrality, and impartiality. We reiterate the need to adopt urgent decisions and measures strictly in adherence to international law, including international humanitarian law, immediately, in order to save human lives and to strengthen collective confidence in multilateralism as an effective instrument to achieve peace. Peru would like to express a strong hope that with lucidity we will find the right path and with sufficient speed that the situation requires. Thank you.
The distinguished representative of Peru for his statement. Distinguished representatives, we have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon in this hall after consideration of the draft resolution as agreed earlier. The General Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 5. The meeting is adjourned.